I've been putting money away for 4 years, and I never told a single person outside of my younger brother what it was for. Not my husband. Not my closest friend at work. Not even my mother, who would have cried and told me not to, and then cried again when I didn't listen. Every paycheck from my job as a registered nurse at St. Michael's, every extra shift I picked up during holiday weekends and flu season, every tax return I didn't spend on a trip somewhere warm. It all went into a separate account I named simply the cabin fund. My husband thought I was aggressive about saving because I was anxious about retirement. I let him think that. My parents had been married for 45 years come the last Saturday of September, and they had spent almost all of those years in a small 2-bedroom house in Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of house where the pipes freeze every February, and you learn to leave a tap running overnight, just to make sure you still have water in the morning. My father, Walter, not that Walter, my father, had worked in underground mining operations for 28 years before his knees gave out. He took early disability at 59 and spent the first year of it feeling guilty about it, like he had failed some quota he'd set for himself before he was old enough to know better. My mother worked part-time at a pharmacy for most of my childhood, then full-time after I left for nursing school, then part-time again when her arthritis made the longer shifts too much. Between the two of them, they had never once taken a vacation that didn't involve driving somewhere and sleeping in a cousin's spare room. There was a lake property 2 hours north of Huntsville that I'd been watching online for almost 3 years before the price dropped. A 3-bedroom cottage with a wraparound deck, a wood stove in the main room, a dock that needed some work, and a view of the water that I could feel through the screen of my phone. It had been listed at $389,000. Then $365,000. Then after 18 months, it finally landed at $340,000 when the owners accepted that the market wasn't coming back to where they'd hoped. I had $280,000 in the fund. My brother lent me $40,000 from his line of credit, interest-free, on the condition that I let him be there when our parents found out. I took a small personal loan for the remainder, and I closed on it in February, in the middle of a snowstorm, signing papers at a notary's office, with my coat still on, because the heat was slow to come up. The plan was their anniversary. My brother and I told our parents we were taking them on a surprise weekend. Just a little family trip up north, nothing fancy. We'd rented a place for a few days. My mother packed her good cardigan. My father brought his fishing rod even though we hadn't mentioned fishing, because that's who my father is. He assumes any body of water is a reasonable excuse. My husband's name is Rourke, and he is a good man in most of the ways that count. He is patient with me when I work nights. He remembers things I've mentioned once and never repeated. He was the one who taught me how to properly seal a window in winter, which sounds small but actually isn't when you're from a place where the cold has opinions. His parents are a different story, and I say that with 6 years of first-hand evidence behind me. His mother is the kind of woman who makes every room feel slightly smaller than it was before she walked in. Not because she's loud, exactly, but because she has a way of positioning herself at the center of any situation, any conversation, any occasion, as though the event itself was only waiting for her to give it meaning. His father largely goes along with whatever she decides, not out of agreement necessarily, but because the alternative requires more energy than he's ever been willing to spend. I had known this about them since before I married Rourke. What I had not known, or perhaps had not allowed myself to fully accept, was how far that tendency could actually reach. I told Rourke about the cottage a week before the anniversary weekend. I had to, logistically. I needed him to drive up early with the groceries and some of the decorating supplies so everything would be ready when I brought my parents. He was quiet for a moment when I explained what I'd done and what I'd spent, and then he said something that should have been the first clue. He said, "My parents are going to want to see it." I said we'd have them up sometime in the fall, once my parents were settled and comfortable and it felt like their place. He nodded. I thought the conversation was finished. I should have paid more attention to his expression when it wasn't. The Saturday of my parents' anniversary was cold the way October in Ontario gets cold. Not brutal yet, but serious, like a reminder that winter is standing just around the next bend and it knows your name. I picked my parents up from the motel in Bracebridge where they'd stayed the night, my mother in her good blue wool coat, my father in his fishing vest layered over a plaid shirt, because he has never fully accepted that there are other ways to dress for an occasion he's excited about. The drive to the lake took 40 minutes from the motel. My mother held my hand across the center console for most of it, and asked careful questions about the rental. How many beds? Was there a proper kitchen? Would we be warm enough? My father looked out the window at the turning maples and said almost nothing, which is how he shows he's happy. When we turned onto the gravel road that led down to the property, I felt something loosen in my chest that I had been holding tight for 4 years. And then I saw the cars. There were 2 vehicles parked in front of the cottage that I did not recognize as belonging to anyone I had invited. A dark gray SUV and a silver sedan, both with Ontario plates. I knew those cars. I had seen them in the driveway of my in-laws' house in Barrie enough times to recognize the small dent on the rear bumper of the SUV. My mother was already pointing at the deck. "Oh, it's lovely," she said. "Look at the water from here." I pulled in and said nothing. I was still processing. The front door of the cottage was open. Not unlocked, open. And coming through it, carrying what looked like a box of kitchen items, was my sister-in-law. Her name is Paige, and she is 31 years old, and she has spent most of those years operating on the assumption that what belongs to her brother, also by extension, belongs to her, in some ambient and unspoken way. She is not a cruel person. She is something more complicated than cruel. She is someone who has been raised to believe that family is a resource to be pooled, which sounds generous until you realize it only flows in one direction. Behind her, through the open door, I could see my mother-in-law arranging something on the kitchen counter. And deeper inside, the outline of furniture that was not mine. My mother had already gotten out of the car. She was standing on the gravel path, smiling at the view, completely unaware. My father-in-law came around the side of the cottage from the direction of the dock, carrying a folding camp chair. He stopped when he saw me. Something moved across his face that he didn't have time to fully conceal. Not quite guilt, but the look of a man who had decided not to think too hard about something and was now being asked to think about it. "Rourke said you wouldn't be here until 4, he said. "It's 2:30, I said. He nodded slowly. "Right." My mother turned at the sound of our voices, still smiling. She looked between me and my father-in-law with the polite uncertainty of someone who isn't sure if she recognizes a person or just their type. "Oh, hello," she said warmly, because that is who my mother is. She says hello warmly to strangers on her worst days. My mother-in-law appeared in the doorway then, wiping her hands on a dish towel that I recognized immediately because I had bought it in Kensington Market 3 summers ago. She looked at my parents with an expression I can only describe as composure that is working harder than it should have to. "Frances," she said, addressing me directly and ignoring my parents with the practiced ease of someone who has decided they are not relevant to the current conversation. "We thought we'd come up and get the place sorted before your family arrived. We didn't want you running around trying to set up on a big weekend." "You have a key," I said. It wasn't a question. "Rourke gave us a spare," she said, "in case of emergencies." I looked at my husband's family standing inside my cottage. The cottage I had spent 4 years saving for, that my brother had gone into debt to help me buy, that I had signed papers for in a coat because the notary's heat was slow, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to say next. My mother still didn't know. She was looking at the water through the trees. My father had come up beside her and put his hand at the small of her back, the same gesture he's made for as long as I can remember, the one that says I'm here without any words. They were standing there in their good coats, thinking they were guests at a rental cottage, while the actual owners of the property arranged themselves in the kitchen like this had all been settled weeks ago. "Could you come outside for a moment?" I said to my mother-in-law. She set down the dish towel and came out onto the deck with the particular calmness of someone who has already prepared their side of the conversation. My sister-in-law drifted closer to the doorway. My father-in-law stayed where he was, slightly off to the side, hands in his pockets, looking at a fixed point somewhere above the tree line. "What's going on here?" I asked, keeping my voice low enough that my parents, who had wandered a few steps toward the dock path, couldn't hear clearly. "I just explained," she said. "We wanted to help get things ready. Rourke mentioned the cottage and we thought—" "Rourke mentioned it," I repeated. "He said it was a family property, that you'd bought it for weekends and family use." "I bought it," I said. "I, with my money and my brother's help. It is registered in my name. The deed has one name on it, and it is mine." Something shifted in her expression, not guilt, not quite, but the recalibration of someone who has just realized the room is not arranged the way they thought it was. "We were only helping," she said. "We brought things up to make it more comfortable. Some kitchen things, a few extra chairs." "You brought things up to make it yours," I said. And I said it quietly, which I think surprised her more than if I'd raised my voice. "I've watched you do this for 6 years. Small things every time. A comment here, a suggestion there, a boundary moved by half an inch so gradually that it's hard to point to the exact moment it happened. This isn't small. This is my parents' anniversary gift. Their names are on a card in an envelope inside that cottage. And right now my mother thinks she's at a rental property while you're standing in her kitchen. My mother-in-law opened her mouth. I held up one hand. I'm not finished, I said. I'm going to go back to my parents now. I'm going to explain to them that there's been a mix-up and give them a minute. And then you and Paige and Dad are going to load everything you brought back into those cars and leave. I need the key Rourke gave you. Today, Frances, I'm being clear, I said, which I should have been long before today. I walked back to where my parents were standing. My mother had her phone out and was trying to take a photo of the dock through the trees. My father had spotted a great blue heron standing in the shallows about 30 meters out and was pointing at it with the specific quiet delight of a man who has been waiting his whole life for exactly this kind of afternoon. I put my hand on my mother's arm. Mum, I said, there's something I need to tell you. She looked at me, and something in my face must have told her this was not a small thing, because she put her phone in her pocket immediately and gave me her full attention. This isn't a rental, I said. I bought this property 8 months ago, with 4 years of savings and some help from your son. I watched her face change. The deed is in my name, but I bought it for you and Dad, for 45 years of every single thing you gave up so that we could have what we needed. It's yours. Your names are on a card in the kitchen. Happy anniversary. My father turned around. He is not a man who cries easily. He was a miner for almost 3 decades. He is the kind of person who fixes things quietly, who absorbs difficulty without distributing it, who has always, as long as I have known him, taken the part of any situation that required the most patience and handled it without complaint. He stood there for a moment looking at me, and then he looked at the water, and then he looked at my mother, and then his face did something I had only seen it do once before, the day I graduated from nursing school, and he thought I wasn't looking. My mother made a sound that was not quite a word and pulled me into her arms so abruptly that I nearly lost my footing on the gravel. The people inside, she started when she pulled back. They're leaving, I said. It's being sorted. It was being sorted, because at that exact moment my brother arrived. He had driven separately, and he came down the gravel road in his truck, with the particular timing of someone who had planned it this way, parking behind the gray SUV and walking toward us with his hands in his jacket pockets and an expression on his face that said he'd already taken in the extra cars and understood the situation without needing it explained. He looked at our parents for a moment. Our father still hadn't said anything. He was gripping our mother's hand. Happy anniversary, my brother said quietly. Our father nodded once carefully the way he does when he doesn't trust his voice. Rourke arrived 20 minutes later. He had been behind my brother on the highway, delayed by traffic on Highway 11 near Gravenhurst. He pulled in to find his mother and sister loading the last of their boxes into the SUV, his father folding the camp chair he'd brought into the back seat, and me standing on the deck of the cottage watching all of it with my arms crossed and my brother beside me. He stood in the driveway for a moment, taking it in. His face went through several things in quick succession: understanding, shame, something that looked like relief that he hadn't been there for the earlier part of it, and then, underneath all of that, a decision. He walked to his mother first. I need the key, he said. Rourke, sweetheart, the spare. The one I gave you. She reached into her coat pocket and produced it without further argument. Rourke took it and walked past her, up onto the deck, and stood beside me. I should have talked to you before I gave them a key to anything, he said. Not to his mother, not to the driveway generally, but to me quietly in the way of someone who is doing it properly instead of for an audience. I made an assumption about what was mine to share, and I was wrong. I'm sorry. I looked at him for a moment. Yeah, I said. We'll talk about it. Which we did, later at length, in the way that 6 years of marriage teaches you to talk about things. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly, with both people willing to stay in the room until it's finished. His mother left without speaking to me again. My sister-in-law said something vague about meaning well as she got into the passenger seat, which I did not respond to, because meaning well and acting well are different things, and I have spent enough of my life pretending otherwise. His father paused at the driver's side door and looked back at the cottage, and then at me, and said quietly that he was sorry. I believed him, which surprised me a little. He has always been a man more acted upon than acting, and I think the particular shame of that caught up with him on that gravel driveway. By 4 o'clock they were gone, and the silence they left behind was the clean kind, not the held breath kind. Rourke helped me rehang the string lights along the deck railing. My brother got the wood stove going. He's always been better with fires than me, and by the time the sun was sitting low over the water, and the light was doing that thing it does in October in northern Ontario, all gold and sideways and unbearably beautiful. My parents were sitting in 2 Muskoka chairs on the dock with cups of tea, watching the heron, which had not moved. I stood at the kitchen window for a while and watched them. My mother said something to my father and he laughed, which is not a sound I heard enough growing up, a real unguarded laugh, the kind that means the body has forgotten for a moment to brace itself. He had his fishing rod propped against the dock railing, not because he planned to use it, I think, but because having it there made the afternoon feel complete. On the kitchen counter, unopened, was the anniversary card I'd written in February, the night I got the keys. I'd written it at our kitchen table after Rourke had gone to bed, in my coat because the apartment was cold, using a pen that kept skipping. I hadn't known exactly what to say, so I had written the only thing that felt true, that every summer afternoon they had driven us to that lake when we couldn't afford anything more than the smell of the water, and every winter they had made enough feel like plenty. Had made a small house feel like enough of a world. I had been trying to find a way to say thank you for all of it. Not with words, because words weren't enough, but with something they could sit inside. My mother found the card later that evening. She read it at the kitchen table while my father stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, and when she finished, she pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes for a moment. And that was when I had to go outside and stand on the deck by myself for a few minutes. Looking at the water, breathing the cold October air. My father came out and stood beside me. He didn't say much, which is his way, but after a while he said, "Your grandmother would have liked this place," which is the closest my father comes to saying that something has gotten all the way through to him. We stayed the full weekend. On Sunday morning, I watched my father drink his coffee on the dock for 45 minutes, while the lake was still, and the mist was still coming off the water. And I thought about the number of years he had gotten up before anyone else in the house, driven himself to a shaft entrance in the dark, and come home that evening with the kind of tired that settles into a person's bones and doesn't fully leave. 28 years of that. And here he was, coffee cup in both hands, the heron back in the shallows, nothing requiring his attention except the water and the light and the particular piece of a place that now had his name attached to it in a way nothing ever quite had before. My mother repotted a plant she'd brought from home and put it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, the way she does in every space she decides to claim as hers. She did it on Saturday afternoon without ceremony, just moved the plant from her bag to the sill, adjusted it twice until she liked where the light hit it, and that was that. It was the most complete thing I watched happen all weekend. The Muskoka chairs needed repainting, and the dock needed 2 new boards, and the wood stove had a slightly temperamental flue damper, and the driveway flooded at the bottom in a heavy rain, all things I already knew and had budgeted for. None of that mattered. What mattered was that my parents had somewhere that belonged to them, fully and without qualification, a place where the address on the deed matched the name in the mailbox, and nobody could stand in the doorway and tell them otherwise. Rourke and I drove back to the city on Sunday evening. He was quiet for most of the 401 and I let him be, because I was quiet too, and because not every silence is the kind that needs filling. About halfway home, somewhere between Barrie and King City, he said, "I underestimated you." "In what sense?" I asked. "In every sense," he said. 4 years. "I had no idea," I said. "I'm glad you did it," he said. "I'm glad they have it." I looked out at the highway, at the cars moving south toward the city in the early dark. "Me too," I said. "I don't know what happens next with his family. I know that something shifted in that driveway, something that can't be fully unshifted, and I know that the boundaries I should have been clearer about years ago are going to have to be clearer going forward, not as punishment but as structure. Because that is what boundaries actually are. I have spent 6 years softening myself at the edges in spaces where I should have held my shape, and I am 34 years old, and I am done with that now. My parents called on Monday morning, together, on speakerphone, which they have never quite mastered, so the sound quality was terrible, and I could hear my father breathing and my mother moving around in what was clearly the cottage kitchen. She said they'd stayed an extra night because the weather was good and my father wanted to try the fishing off the dock in the morning. "Did he catch anything?" I asked. There was a pause, and then my father's voice, slightly too close to the phone. "Not yet," he said. But I'm not in any rush. Neither was I anymore. Neither was I.